In the deep, shadowed hollows of 1857 Tennessee, the land itself kept secrets. It held the memory of blood in the rich, dark soil and whispered forgotten names on the humid wind that rustled through the endless rows of cotton. History, in these parts, is not always written in books. Sometimes it is etched into the bark of an old oak, or hangs like a phantom in the morning mist. This is the story of such a memory, of a silence stretched so thin it had to break, and of a vengeance so absolute it transformed a man into a symbol. It tells of a reckoning that rose from the fields, culminating in an act so stark, so visually brutal, that it was destined to become a haunting local legend, the tale of the slave who hung his overseer like a scarecrow. If the spectral accounts of the past compel you to listen, and you have only just found this archive, consider subscribing to our circle of researchers, ensuring these hushed voices are never truly lost. The world began and ended with the mist. Before the sun asserted its dominance, a thick white shroud lay over the Braxton plantation, clinging to the low-hanging branches of cypress trees and muffling the sounds of the waking earth. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a place of indistinct forms and suppressed noises. The air, heavy with the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves, carried a chill that seeped into the thin walls of the slave quarters, a cold that had little to do with the temperature. This was a land of profound, suffocating beauty. The rolling hills of Tennessee, emerald in the full light of day, were rendered somber and mysterious by the pre-dawn haze. The cotton fields, stretching out in every direction until they dissolved into the fog, were not a symbol of prosperity, but a vast, silent monument to unending labor. Each bowl, soft and white, represented a debt of sweat and pain, a currency paid by the bodies of the men and women who toiled there from the moment the mist began to thin until long after the sun had bled out across the horizon. The plantation was a carefully constructed universe of control, its geography a map of power. At its heart stood the great house, a white-columned edifice that seemed to float above the vapor, its windows like vacant eyes watching over the domain. From this central point, authority radiated outwards. The overseer's cottage, a more modest but still imposing structure, stood as a forward post, a bastion of immediate and brutal command. Then came the barns, the smokehouse, the workshops, all arranged in a deliberate, functional order. Farthest from the great house, nestled near the edge of a dense wood, were the quarters. A cluster of crudely built cabins, they were positioned to be always under the gaze of the main house and the overseer's cottage, a constant, unspoken reminder of their inhabitants' place in this hierarchy. The very layout of the land was a tool of surveillance, designed to eliminate privacy and foster a sense of perpetual observation. Inside one of these cabins, the darkness was nearly absolute. It was a small, windowless space with a packed earth floor that was cool and damp to the touch. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, wood smoke, and the close proximity of human bodies. Here, silence was not an absence of sound but a presence in itself, a heavy blanket woven from fear and exhaustion. The enslaved learned to move within this silence, to communicate with glances and subtle gestures, for a spoken word at the wrong moment could bring swift and terrible consequences. Life was a rhythm of bells and commands, a cycle of submission dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, but governed by the whim of a master they rarely saw, and an overseer they saw far too often. Before the first bell, in the suffocating quiet of the cabin, a man named Phineas was already awake. He lay on his thin straw pallet, his eyes open to the impenetrable dark, listening to the soft breathing of the others crammed into the small space. Phineas was a quiet man, broad-shouldered and strong from years of labor in the fields, but it was a quietness that ran deeper than mere disposition. It was a practiced, disciplined stillness, a shield he had learned to raise against the world. His hands, calloused and scarred from the unforgiving work of picking cotton, possessed a surprising dexterity. In the rare moments of solitude he could steal, often in the deep twilight after the final meal, he would take a small piece of wood and a sharpened stone and carve. He would carve small, intricate figures of birds, their wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was a secret act of creation in a life dedicated to destruction, a small, defiant piece of beauty in an overwhelmingly ugly existence. He never showed them to anyone. He would hold them in his palm until the wood was warm, then bury them in the soft earth beneath a loose floorboard. They were his, and his alone. The routine of the morning was an exercise in practiced economy of motion, a series of rituals performed without thought or word. The rustle of bodies rising from pallets, the soft scrape of a wooden bowl against the floor, the taste of the meager meal of corn mush, all of it unfolded in the dim, gray light that began to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. There was no conversation, only the shared understanding of the day to come. Fear was the invisible partner to every action. It was in the way they kept their eyes downcast, the way they avoided congregating in groups of more than 2 or 3, the way a sudden noise could make a dozen heads turn in unison. The surveillance was constant and multifaceted. It came from the overseer on his horse, a roaming specter of authority, but it also came from within. Favors could be bought with information, and a careless word whispered in the quarters could find its way to the overseer's ears by midday, with brutal repercussions to follow. This constant threat bred a deep and corrosive mistrust, isolating them from one another even as they lived and worked side by side. The community was a fragile thing, bound by shared suffering but fractured by the ever-present possibility of betrayal. They were a people held captive not just by fences and chains, but by a carefully cultivated atmosphere of dread. The silence was their prison and their shield, a space where they could preserve what little was left of themselves, but also a space where resentment could curdle and harden into something cold and sharp. The arrival of the overseer was never announced by a bell, but by a sound that cut through the morning stillness with a unique and chilling cadence, the steady, rhythmic tread of a single horse. The sound would begin faintly, a distant drumming, and grow steadily louder, an approaching storm. Theron, the man who rode the horse, was the embodiment of the plantation's power, the instrument of its will. He was not a physically imposing man, but he possessed an aura of menace that seemed to add inches to his stature. He sat tall in his saddle, his back ramrod straight, and his eyes, a pale and piercing blue, missed nothing. They swept across the fields, across the rows of workers, across the doorways of the cabins, cataloging every movement, every hesitation, every downcast glance. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. His authority was absolute, conveyed through a cold stare, a slight curl of his lip, a casual gesture towards the bullwhip that was perpetually coiled at his side. The whip was more than a tool. It was a symbol of his office, a constant, visible promise of the pain he was empowered to inflict. His cruelty was not born of explosive rage, but of a methodical, almost scientific application of terror. He understood that fear was a more effective motivator than ambition or hope. He nurtured it, cultivated it, and used it to maintain the rigid order upon which the plantation depended. He would ride through the fields, his horse's hooves making soft thuds on the dirt paths between the cotton rows, and a palpable tension would follow in his wake. Hands would move faster, backs would bend lower, and the oppressive silence would deepen until it was almost a physical weight. Theron's presence was a constant, grinding pressure. He would materialize without warning, his horse moving with an unnatural, quiet, and would sit motionless for long stretches, simply watching. The weight of his gaze was a physical burden, making the air feel thicker, the sun hotter. He derived a visible satisfaction from the discomfort he caused, the quiet panic that rippled through the workforce as they sensed his eyes upon them. His methods were insidious. He would create rules and then punish infractions that had never been articulated, fostering a state of perpetual uncertainty. A worker might be denied water for looking up at the sky, or be forced to work through the midday meal for a perceived slowness that only Theron himself had detected. These were not punishments for breaking the established order. They were punishments designed to reinforce the fact that he was the order. He was the law, and the law could change from one moment to the next. He moved with a languid, almost lazy confidence, a man utterly secure in his position. The creak of his leather saddle, the jingle of the harness, the soft snort of his horse, these were the sounds that heralded his approach, and they were sounds that could make a man's blood run cold. He was the face of their oppression, the daily, tangible manifestation of the system that held them in bondage. The distant, unseen master in the great house was an abstract concept. Theron was the reality. He was the hand that held the whip, the voice that gave the commands, the cold eyes that watched them from dawn until dusk. As the mist finally burned away under the strengthening morning sun, revealing the vast and unforgiving expanse of the cotton fields, Phineas watched him from beneath the brim of his worn hat. He watched the straight line of Theron's back, the casual way he rested a hand on the coiled whip at his hip, and felt the familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. The day had just begun, but the air was already thick with a misery that felt as old as the land itself. The silence of the fields was broken only by the rhythmic rustle of cotton being pulled from the bolls, a sound that would continue, uninterrupted, for the rest of the day, a monotonous whisper of their collective and unending servitude. The cruelty of Theron was a constant, like the oppressive humidity of a Tennessee summer. It was not a thing of fits and starts, but a steady, grinding pressure applied to the lives of the enslaved day after day, a methodical erosion of spirit. His punishments were a form of public theater, designed not only to inflict pain upon an individual, but to terrorize the collective. The crack of his whip was the most common sound to punctuate the drudgery of the fields, a sharp, tearing report that would echo across the landscape and then be swallowed by a profound silence. When the whip fell, all other sounds seemed to cease. The rustle of cotton plants, the buzz of insects, the weary sighs of the laborers, all would be momentarily suspended, replaced by a universal, internal flinch. Every man and woman, no matter how far away, would feel the ghost of that lash on their own back. The act was always performed with a chilling lack of passion. Theron would dismount from his horse with a deliberate slowness, his movements economical and precise. He would instruct the unfortunate soul to approach a specific water oak that stood alone at the edge of the main field, its trunk scarred and darkened from countless similar encounters. There was no shouting, no display of rage. He would simply state the supposed infraction, his voice a low monotone that carried an unnerving distance in the still air. He said a man had been too slow in his row, or that a woman had not shown the proper deference in her gaze. The reasons were often arbitrary, a demonstration that reason itself had no place here. There was only his will. Then he would uncoil the whip, its leather length falling to the dust with a soft hiss, and the performance would begin. He was an artist of his grim trade, knowing exactly how to draw the line between incapacitating a worker and instilling the maximum amount of fear and agony. These daily humiliations were the bedrock of his control. He had a particular disdain for any expression of individual identity. A song hummed quietly in the fields, a brightly colored scrap of cloth tied in a woman's hair, a moment of shared laughter between two men, all were treated as acts of insurrection. He would force people to stand for hours in the direct sun without water, their heads bowed, until they collapsed from heat and exhaustion. He would assign impossible tasks, such as moving a pile of heavy stones from one end of the plantation to the other, and then back again, for no purpose other than to demonstrate the futility of their labor and the totality of his power over their bodies and their time. He would manipulate their meager food rations, rewarding those who he perceived as most subservient and starving those who showed the slightest spark of defiance. It was a calculated system of psychological warfare, designed to break them down, to isolate them from one another, to make them forget they were human and believe they were merely tools, instruments of his will, as inanimate as the hoes and plows they wielded. The silence he enforced was his greatest weapon. By forbidding communication, he sought to prevent the formation of bonds, the sharing of grievances, the very possibility of organized thought. He wanted them to exist in a state of atomized fear, each person alone with their misery, their gaze fixed on the ground before them. For reasons that were never spoken but were understood by all, Theron's particular brand of dispassionate cruelty was often focused on Phineas. Perhaps it was Phineas's unnerving stillness, the way he absorbed commands and punishments with a quiet stoicism that could be mistaken for insolence. While others might cry out or beg, Phineas would simply absorb the pain, his face a mask of impenetrable calm. This silent endurance seemed to infuriate the overseer, who interpreted it not as submission, but as a deep and profound form of defiance. Phineas's existence was a quiet challenge to Theron's authority, a refusal to grant him the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. Theron singled him out relentlessly. He would assign Phineas the most grueling sections of the field, where the sun beat down without mercy and the cotton bolls were thick with thorns. He would find fault with Phineas's work where none existed, pulling apart a perfectly gathered bundle of cotton and claiming it was poorly done, forcing him to start over as the others moved on. The punishments directed at Phineas were often more subtle, more psychologically pointed. One sweltering afternoon, Theron rode up to Phineas and, without a word, took his gourd of water and slowly poured it onto the thirsty ground. He then sat on his horse for the next hour, watching as Phineas continued to work, his lips cracking, his body screaming for a single drop of moisture. The other workers averted their eyes, the injustice of the act a palpable thing, hanging in the hot, still air. They could feel Theron's gaze sweeping over them, daring them to show a flicker of sympathy, a sign of solidarity that he could then punish. On another occasion, Theron discovered one of Phineas's small, carved birds, a piece he had accidentally dropped near the cabins. The overseer picked it up, examined the delicate, outstretched wings with a sneer of contempt, and then, in front of everyone gathered for the evening meal, he crushed it under the heel of his boot. He ground the splintered wood into the dirt, his eyes locked on Phineas the entire time. He said that such things were a waste of time, that their hands were for labor and nothing more. The act was meant to strip Phineas of his last private refuge, to demonstrate that no part of his life, not even his secret thoughts or his small acts of creation, was beyond the overseer's reach. Phineas did not react. He simply stared at the spot in the dirt where the bird had been, the dust and splinters that were all that remained. But inside him, something was shifting. The wall of silence he had built around himself, once a defensive shield, was beginning to feel like a cage. Each humiliation, each act of calculated cruelty, was a hammer blow against it, and he could feel the fractures beginning to spread. The quiet observer was being forced to see the world not just as a place of suffering to be endured, but as a machine of oppression that he was a part of. In the deep, suffocating darkness of the slave quarters, The silence imposed by the overseer would fray at the edges. The night was a different world, a temporary respite from the all-seeing eyes of Theron. Here, in the close, humid air of the cabins, whispers moved like ghosts. They were fragmented, cautious, spoken in the Gullah dialect that was a mystery to the white men, a language of shared history and secret meaning. Fear was still the dominant emotion, a constant, low hum beneath the floorboards. But now, it was mixing with something else, something sharper and more dangerous, a quiet, simmering defiance. The stories began to circulate. Tales of Theron's escalating cruelty passed from one cabin to the next in hushed tones. They spoke of the water poured into the dust, of the crushed bird, of the endless, pointless tasks. These were not just reports of suffering, they were entries in a ledger of wrongs, a collective accounting of the overseer's sins. The whispers were a form of resistance in themselves, a reclaiming of the narrative that Theron sought to control. They were weaving a tapestry of shared experience, stitching their individual pains together into a single, coherent story of injustice. An older man named Cato, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his eyes holding the wisdom of long and bitter experience, would sometimes tell stories. He would not speak directly of rebellion, for that was a word too dangerous to even think. Instead, he would tell the old tales, the stories of Anansi the spider, a small and seemingly powerless creature who used his wits to outsmart opponents who were far larger and stronger. He would tell of how the spider could trap a tiger or trick a python, and the people gathered in the darkness would listen, their faces illuminated by the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. The meaning was clear. The stories were a lesson in strategy, a reminder that strength did not always come from brute force. They were a spark of hope in the suffocating darkness, a suggestion that even the most formidable oppressor had weaknesses that could be exploited. Phineas would sit in the corner, his back against the rough-hewn wooden wall, listening to these whispers, to these stories. He would say nothing, his face a mask of shadow. But he was no longer just the quiet observer. The things he heard in the night, combined with the things he endured during the day, were hardening him, turning his silent endurance into a cold, focused resolve. The shadows in the cabin seemed to be thickening, no longer just an absence of light, but a space where new and dangerous thoughts could take root. The cruelty that was intended to break them was instead forging a bond, a fragile but powerful sense of shared purpose, born in the darkness and nurtured by whispers. The air was growing heavier, charged with an unspoken question that hung in the silence between the storyteller's words. How much longer could this go on? The breaking point arrived not with the familiar crack of the whip, but with a quiet and far more insidious violation. It happened on a day when the air was so thick with heat and moisture that it felt like a wet cloth pressed against the face. The work in the fields had been punishing, a relentless cycle of stooping and pulling under a sun that offered no mercy. As the exhausted workers were led back toward the quarters for their meager evening meal, Theron, on his horse, seemed to be in a particularly foul humor. His eyes, small and hard, scanned the line of hunched figures, searching for a target, a nail to hammer down. His gaze settled on Phineas. The overseer dismounted and, with a smug, knowing look, walked directly to Phineas's cabin. He did not ask for permission to enter. He simply kicked the flimsy door open and stepped inside, his spurred boots scraping against the packed earth floor. The others stopped, a silent, fearful audience to a play they did not understand but whose tragic conclusion they could already sense. Phineas was made to follow him into the small, dark space. Inside, Theron began a slow, deliberate search. He overturned the thin straw pallets, kicked aside the few wooden bowls, and ran his hands along the rough-hewn walls. There was a cold certainty to his movements, a sense that he was not merely searching, but confirming something he already knew. Perhaps a whisper had been sold for an extra ration, or perhaps he had simply noticed a loose floorboard on a previous inspection. His hand stopped, and a cruel smile touched his lips. He pried the board loose and reached into the shallow space beneath. One by one, he pulled out the small, carved birds. There were more than a dozen of them, a silent flock that Phineas had painstakingly brought to life in stolen moments of twilight. Theron arranged them in a neat row on the floor, their delicate wooden wings catching the dim light slanting through the open doorway. He did not smash them. That would have been too simple, too quick. Instead, he gestured to the small, cold hearth in the center of the cabin. He told Phineas to light a fire. The command was spoken in a low, conversational tone, which made it all the more menacing. Phineas remained motionless, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the small wooden figures. Theron's voice hardened slightly. He repeated the command and nudged one of the birds with the toe of his boot. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Phineas knelt and, with trembling hands, used a flint and steel to coax a small flame from a pile of kindling. The fire caught, its small light throwing dancing, monstrous shadows against the cabin walls. Then came the final, unthinkable order. Theron told him to pick up the birds, one at a time, and place them in the fire himself. He said he wanted to see Phineas erase his own foolishness. This was the true nature of the overseer's cruelty. It was not enough to punish the body. He had to force a man to participate in the destruction of his own soul. He wanted to make Phineas the instrument of his own despair, to turn his hands, the same hands that had created such delicate beauty, into agents of its annihilation. Phineas looked from the fire to the birds, and then to Theron's impassive face. For a long moment, the world seemed to narrow to this single, suffocating point. The heat from the growing fire, the smell of wood smoke, the silent, watching eyes of the other slaves just outside the door, all faded into an indistinct blur. He could feel a lifetime of swallowed rage, of silent endurance, of carefully suppressed humanity, beginning to rise within him, a tide of pure, cold poison. He knelt, his movements stiff and mechanical, and picked up the first bird. It was a carving of a hawk, its wings spread wide. He held it in his palm, the familiar weight of it, the smooth texture of the wood, a final, fleeting connection to the man he had been. Then, with a motion that felt utterly alien to him, he tossed it into the flames. The wood blackened instantly, then curled, and was consumed by a burst of orange light. He picked up the next, and the next, and the next. With each offering to the fire, a part of him turned to ash. He was no longer just a victim of Theron's cruelty. He was now its accomplice. When the last bird was gone, and the fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers, Theron gave a single, satisfied nod. He told Phineas that now his hands were good only for the work he assigned them. Then he turned and left the cabin, stepping out into the twilight, a man content with the thoroughness of his lesson. Phineas remained kneeling on the dirt floor, his eyes fixed on the dying coals. He did not move for a very long time. The other people, sensing that something profound and terrible had just transpired, slowly dispersed, their silence heavier than ever before. Inside the cabin, a great and profound stillness had fallen over Phineas. The raging tide he had felt rising within him had not broken. It had frozen. The heat of his fury had been replaced by an arctic calm, a clarity of purpose so absolute that it felt like a religious conversion. All the fear that had governed his life, the constant, gnawing anxiety of the whip and the chain, had been burned away with the last of his birds. It was gone. In its place was a vast, empty space, and in the center of that space was a single, hard, unshakable thought. Theron had to die. It was no longer a question of justice or revenge. It had become a simple, mechanical necessity, a correction that the world required. The man who had carved birds was dead, incinerated in the hearth of his own home. The man who remained was something else entirely, a creature of pure, cold resolve. He had been pushed past the breaking point, and in the territory beyond, there were no rules, no masters, and no fear. There was only the task that lay ahead. His breathing was even, his heartbeat slow and steady. He was no longer a slave, enduring his bondage. He was a craftsman, contemplating his work. He rose from the floor, his movements no longer hesitant but imbued with a new and terrible grace. The silence that had once been his shield was now his weapon. When the last light had faded from the sky and the plantation was draped in the profound darkness of a moonless night, Phineas began to move. He slipped out of his cabin like a shadow, his bare feet making no sound on the cool earth. The night was alive with the familiar symphony of the Tennessee wilderness, the chirping of crickets, the deep croak of bullfrogs, the distant call of a nightjar. To anyone else, these sounds were merely the backdrop of the night. To Phineas, they were a cloak, a curtain of noise that would mask his own movements. He knew the geography of the plantation as well as he knew the lines on his own scarred hands. He knew which floorboards creaked in the barn, which gate hinge was rusted and loud, which paths were covered in soft loam, and which were strewn with noisy gravel. He moved with the instinct of an animal in its own territory, a ghost in the machine of his own oppression. His first destination was the tool shed, a small, windowless outbuilding that stood near the barns. The lock on the door was a simple iron hasp, and he worked it loose with a piece of metal he had sharpened over weeks for a different, less final purpose. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of oil, rust, and worked wood. He did not need a light. He moved by touch, his fingers finding the familiar shapes of the tools. He was not looking for an axe or a knife. Such a weapon would be too loud, too messy. His plan was something different, something that required a more particular set of instruments. His fingers closed around the handle of a heavy mallet, the kind used for driving fence posts. He felt its weight, its balance. Then he found what he was truly looking for, a long, thick coil of hemp rope, stored away for mending fences or hoisting feed into the loft. It was strong, durable, and pliable. He tested its strength, pulling a section taut between his powerful hands. It would do. He also took a smaller, finer length of cord and a small, sharp awl used for leather work. He was a craftsman again, gathering his materials. He carried the tools back to his cabin, a silent, purposeful phantom in the deep night. He hid them beneath the same loose floorboard where his birds had once nested. The irony was a cold, distant thing, an observation without emotion. The space that had once held his secret life now held the instruments of another man's death. He sat on his pallet in the total darkness, the coil of rope beside him, and began his work. He was not merely planning an ambush, he was preparing a stage. With the awl, he began to meticulously work on the rope, fashioning a complex and brutally efficient knot at one end. His hands, the same hands that had carved the delicate feathers on a bird's wing, now worked with a grim and focused precision. Every twist, every loop was deliberate, a testament to a mind that had moved beyond rage and into the realm of cold, calculated execution. He was not just preparing to kill the overseer. He was preparing to make a statement. He was reclaiming his own hands, turning them from instruments of forced labor into instruments of will. The lantern that was his anchor in this task was one he did not light. It existed only in his mind's eye, a flickering point of concentration in the vast darkness. It was the flame of his resolve, a light that burned away all distraction, all hesitation, all residual traces of the man he used to be. The night wore on. The chorus of the insects outside the cabin seemed to swell and then fade. The breathing of the other sleepers in the cabin was a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the silent, methodical work of his hands. He was utterly alone, adrift on a sea of quiet determination. By the time the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, he was finished. The rope lay coiled at his feet, a dormant serpent. He had done all he could in the darkness. Now, all that was left was to wait for the dawn and for the man who rode the horse. Dawn did not so much arrive as seep into the world, a slow dilution of the night's absolute blackness. It was a cold, damp morning, the air carrying the metallic scent of imminent rain. Phineas was already in place, had been for hours, concealed within a dense thicket of blackberry bushes that bordered the narrow track leading from the overseer's cottage to the edge of the cotton fields. This was Theron's unvarying path, a route he rode every morning, a ritual of inspection that affirmed his dominion over the land and its people. Phineas had chosen the spot with the same meticulous care he had once used to select a piece of wood for carving. The path here was hemmed in by a thick stand of pine and oak, creating a natural corridor that would muffle sound. The ground was soft and forgiving, a mixture of damp earth and fallen pine needles that would swallow the sound of his movements. From his position, he had a clear view of the track for 50 yards before it curved out of sight. He lay on his stomach, the dampness of the ground seeping through his thin shirt, his body preternaturally still. He was not a man hiding. He was a feature of the landscape, another shadow in a world of shadows. The heavy mallet lay on the ground beside him, its handle smooth and cool beneath his fingers. The coiled rope was looped over his shoulder, its weight a dense and reassuring presence. His mind was a placid lake. The turbulent emotions of the previous day, the searing humiliation and the volcanic rage, had cooled and hardened into something else entirely. He felt no anger, no hatred, no fear. There was only a profound and crystalline sense of purpose, a single, unwavering objective that had crowded out all other thought. He was a machine calibrated for a single task, his senses honed to an almost painful acuity. He could smell the decay of wet leaves, feel the almost imperceptible vibration of the earth, and hear the individual wing beats of a mosquito hovering near his ear. The world had become a tapestry of sensory information, and he was at its center, waiting for a single, specific thread to be pulled. The first sound was not the one he expected. It was the distant, mournful crow of a rooster from the far side of the plantation, a lonely cry against the encroaching light. Then, silence returned, deeper than before. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each one marked by the slow, rhythmic beat of his own heart. He watched as the pre-dawn light began to reveal the world in stark, monochromatic detail. The dew on a spider's web became a string of tiny gray pearls. The texture of the bark on a nearby pine tree emerged from the gloom, a rugged, intricate map. This was the world that Theron believed he owned, a world Phineas was about to irrevocably alter. Then it came. A faint, metallic click, the sound of an iron latch being lifted on a wooden door, carried on the still morning air. Phineas's entire being focused on that sound. He did not move, but a change occurred within him, a final, silent shift from stillness to readiness. A few moments later, a new sound joined the chorus of the waking wilderness, the slow, deliberate tread of a horse. It grew steadily, a rhythmic thudding that was both monotonous and filled with a terrible suspense. Thump, 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 the sound of approaching fate. Phineas could hear the creak of saddle leather, the soft jingle of the bit and harness. The symphony of the mundane had become the overture to a reckoning. A dark shape emerged from around the bend in the path. First, the horse, a large, dark gelding, its head low, its breath pluming in the cool air. Then the rider, Theron, sitting unnaturally straight in the saddle, a rigid silhouette against the brightening sky. He looked neither left nor right, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face set in its usual mask of detached authority. He was a man moving through a world he did not see, so convinced of his power that the possibility of a threat from within it had ceased to exist. The crickets, which had been chirping their incessant, high-pitched song, fell silent, as if sensing the sudden concentration of violence in the air. The world seemed to hold its breath. Phineas moved. It was not a decision but an instinct, an explosion of coiled energy. He rose from the thicket in a single, fluid motion, a dark shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows. He did not rush at the man, but at the horse. In his hand was the heavy mallet. He took 2 long, swift strides and brought the mallet down not with its head, but with a sharp, stinging blow from its long handle against the horse's powerful hindquarters. The impact was not enough to injure, but it was a shocking, unexpected violation. The horse, a creature of routine and placid temperament, reacted with pure, instinctual terror. It let out a high, panicked whinny and lunged forward, bucking violently. Theron, taken completely by surprise, was a testament to his own arrogance. His posture of command became his undoing. Unprepared for the sudden, violent movement, he was thrown from the saddle, a clumsy, flailing shape that landed with a heavy, sickening thud in the soft dirt of the path. He let out a sharp cry of pain and surprise. The horse, its eyes wide with fear, bolted down the track and disappeared into the woods, the sound of its frantic hoofbeats fading into the distance. For a single, frozen moment, there was only the sight of the overseer on the ground. His authority vanished, his body reduced to a simple collection of vulnerable limbs. The ambush had been brutally, flawlessly effective. The silence that followed the horse's flight was absolute, a vacuum where the sounds of the world had been. Theron pushed himself up, his face a mixture of shock, fury, and a dawning, animal fear. He saw Phineas standing over him, the mallet held loosely in one hand, the coiled rope on his shoulder. The overseer's mind, accustomed to a universe of absolute order with himself at its apex, could not immediately process what was happening. He opened his mouth, perhaps to issue a command, perhaps to scream a threat, but no words came out. He saw in Phineas's eyes not the cowed, resentful submission he was used to, but a chilling, emotionless calm, the placid gaze of a predator that has already secured its kill. That gaze shattered Theron's world. He scrambled backwards in the dirt, his hand fumbling at his belt for the pistol he sometimes carried, but it was not there. He was unarmed, unhorsed, and for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. The fear that he had so expertly cultivated in others now flooded his own veins, a cold and paralyzing tide. He was no longer the overseer. He was just a man, cornered and terrified. Phineas advanced, his movements slow and deliberate. The struggle, when it came, was not the clash of 2 equal combatants. It was a raw, desperate, and ugly affair. Theron, fueled by panic, lunged at Phineas, trying to grapple with him, to use his wiry strength to overpower him. But Phineas was a man whose entire body was a single, hardened muscle, forged by years of brutal labor. He met the overseer's desperate charge not with intricate skill, but with overwhelming, implacable force. He absorbed Theron's clumsy blows and wrapped his powerful arms around him, a grip of pure iron. They fell to the ground together, a tangle of limbs, their grunts and strained breathing, the only sounds in the still morning air. The damp earth clung to their clothes and skin. Theron fought with the frantic energy of a trapped animal, kicking and clawing, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and terror. He was used to inflicting violence from a distance, from the back of a horse, with the length of a whip. This proximity, this raw, physical contact with one of his charges, was a horrifying violation of the natural order as he understood it. He could feel the sheer, unyielding power in Phineas's body, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he was going to die. Phineas did not seem to be fighting so much as performing a task. He methodically subdued the overseer's struggles, his movements economical and brutally efficient. He used his weight to pin Theron to the ground, one hand pressing the man's face into the damp pine needles, muffling his panicked cries. With his other hand, he reached for the rope. He unlooped it from his shoulder and, with a terrifying calm precision, began to work. Theron twisted beneath him, his struggles becoming weaker, his energy sapped by terror and the suffocating pressure. Phineas passed the rope with the complex knot around the overseer's neck. He pulled it tight with a single, powerful jerk. Theron's body convulsed. A choked, gurgling sound escaped his throat, a sound that was not quite human. His hands clawed at the rope, at Phineas's implacable hands, but there was no purchase. His eyes, wide and bulging, stared up into the calm, empty face of the man he had tormented. In those final moments, Theron saw the complete and total inversion of his world. He saw the end of his authority, the end of his power, the end of his life, all in the dispassionate eyes of a man he had considered less than human. Phineas held the rope taut, his gaze unwavering, until the last, desperate twitching ceased. He felt the life drain out of the body beneath him, the final release of tension as the overseer's struggles ended. The body went limp. Phineas did not move immediately. He remained there, kneeling over the corpse, the silence of the woods rushing back in to fill the void left by the violence. The air was still cool. The light was still gray. The world had not ended. Only Theron's world had. Slowly, the distant, cautious chirping of a single cricket began, then another and another, as the natural order of the wilderness reasserted itself, indifferent to the human drama that had just concluded. Phineas let go of the rope. He got to his feet, his breathing heavy but even. He looked down at the still form on the ground, a discarded object, a thing of no consequence. There was no feeling of triumph, no surge of satisfaction. There was only a great and profound emptiness, the quiet that comes after a storm has passed. The act of killing was complete. The personal debt had been paid, but Phineas was not finished. The silence that followed the death was not an ending, it was an intermission. The first part of his work was done. The second, the transformation of this simple act of personal vengeance into a public and terrifying message, was about to begin. The death of the overseer had been a sound swallowed by the woods, a brief and brutal spasm of violence that the wider world had not registered. But the body, the physical remnant of Theron's power, was not meant for a secret grave. It was a text to be published, a sermon to be delivered in a language that everyone on the plantation would understand. Phineas stood over the corpse for a long moment, the gray dawn light casting a flat, unforgiving sheen on the dead man's pale skin. The silence of the forest path was a blank canvas. Now, he would paint his masterpiece upon it. He bent down, and with a grunt of exertion, hauled the body onto his shoulders. The weight was immense, a dead, uncooperative burden that tested the limits of his prodigious strength. Theron's limbs dangled, his head lolling against Phineas's back, a grotesque parody of a familiar childhood piggyback ride. Each step was a struggle. The soft earth of the path gave way to the damp, matted grass at the edge of the cotton fields, and the body dragged behind him, leaving a dark, slick trail in the dew. Phineas's breath came in ragged bursts, the only sound accompanying his grim procession. He was a lone figure moving through the half-light, a priest carrying a sacrifice to an unholy altar. His destination was not chosen at random. It was a place of maximum visibility, a point of convergence. At the intersection of the two largest fields stood a massive fence post, thicker and taller than the others, used to anchor the long stretches of wire fencing that separated the Braxton land from the neighboring property. It was made of solid oak, weathered to a silvery gray, and topped with a single, thick crossbeam. It was a landmark, a point of reference for the field hands, a place where Theron himself would often stop his horse to survey his domain. It was, in its own way, a throne. Reaching the post, Phineas let the body slide from his shoulders to the ground. It landed in a crumpled heap at the base of the wood, a tangle of limbs and dirt-stained clothing. For a moment, he simply stood, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat despite the morning chill. He looked at the post, then at the body, his mind a quiet and methodical workshop. He was no longer a man driven by passion. He was an engineer solving a problem of leverage and balance. He took the long hemp rope, still knotted around Theron's neck, and threw the free end over the thick crossbeam. The rope snagged, and he had to throw it a second time. On the third attempt, it sailed over, the heavy coil thudding softly on the other side. He walked around the post, picked up the end, and began to pull. The initial resistance was immense. The dead weight of the body seemed to root it to the earth. Phineas dug his heels into the soft ground, his back muscles bunching into hard knots, the rope cutting into his calloused hands. Slowly, agonizingly, the body began to rise. It scraped against the rough bark of the post, the sound a loud, abrasive rasp in the stillness. First the head, then the shoulders, then the torso, lifting from the ground in a series of grotesque, jerking motions. The head, pulled taut by the noose, was bent at an unnatural angle, the chin pressed hard against the chest. The body twisted slowly as it ascended, a gruesome pendulum turning in the still air. When the feet were a full 6 feet clear of the ground, Phineas stopped pulling. With practiced efficiency, he wrapped the rope around the base of the post, securing it with a series of tight, immovable knots. The body was now suspended, a dead thing hanging in the dawn. But this was not enough. A hanged man was a common enough sight, a simple execution. Phineas's vision was for something far more potent, a piece of theater that would burn itself into the memory of all who saw it. He had not brought the overseer's body here simply to hang it. He had brought it here to display it, to transform it from a mere corpse into a symbol. He took the smaller, finer cord from his pocket. Working quickly, he grabbed one of the overseer's limp arms and pulled it upwards and outwards, stretching it along the length of the wooden crossbeam. The arm was heavy and stiff, the joint protesting with a faint, dry crackle. Phineas held it in place with his shoulder while his hands worked with the cord, lashing the wrist securely to the wood. The knots were small and tight, the work of a man who understood how to bind things. Then he moved to the other side and repeated the process, pulling the other arm out to its full extension and securing it to the opposite end of the crossbeam. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The body was no longer just hanging, it was crucified. The arms were stretched wide, the palms of the hands turned slightly upwards, in a grotesque mockery of a gesture of welcome or supplication. The figure was now perfectly, hideously symmetrical, a man-shaped kite tethered to the earth. It had become an effigy, a scarecrow. The man who had once ruled these fields with an iron fist, whose authority had been absolute, was now a powerless, floppy puppet, his limbs arranged by the hands of a man he had considered his property. The gesture was an act of profound and chilling blasphemy, a deliberate inversion of the symbols of power and suffering that defined their world. It was a statement of ultimate contempt. Phineas stepped back, his work complete. He looked up at the figure he had created, silhouetted against the rapidly brightening eastern sky. The first rays of the sun were now cresting the distant hills, and a pale, watery light began to spill across the landscape. The light caught the hanging figure, illuminating it, casting a long, impossibly distorted shadow that stretched out over the rows of cotton, a finger of darkness pointing toward the great house. The morning mist, which still clung to the low-lying areas of the fields, swirled around the base of the post, making it appear as though the Scarecrow was floating above the earth. A slight breeze picked up, a harbinger of the coming day, and the body swayed, a slow, almost imperceptible rotation. The movement was hypnotic, a gentle, rhythmic motion that belied the horror of the image. The clothes on the corpse, Theron's familiar dark coat and trousers, fluttered slightly in the wind. The head, heavy and broken, lolled on its chest. It was a silent, terrible sentinel, placed at the heart of the plantation to stand guard over a new and terrifying reality. This was a horror designed not to be fleeting, but to endure. It was a weapon made of flesh and rope and wood, a psychological assault aimed at the very foundation of the plantation's order. It was a message delivered without a single spoken word, yet its meaning was terrifyingly clear. It said that the order of things could be broken. It said that the hunted could become the hunter. It said that the power of the whip and the chain was not absolute. It whispered that even the masters were made of flesh and blood, and that their flesh could be arranged and displayed for all to see. The fields, which had for so long been a stage for their oppression, were now haunted by this new, inescapable image. It would be the first thing the other slaves saw when the bell called them to the fields. It would be the last thing they saw as they returned, exhausted, to their quarters. It would stand there under the brutal midday sun and in the pale light of the moon, a constant, silent reminder of the day that the world had been turned upside down. Phineas looked at it one last time, his face devoid of any emotion. Then he turned and melted back into the shadows of the woods, his presence dissolving as completely as a wisp of morning fog. The Scarecrow was left alone to greet the rising Sunday. The first sign that the world had been fractured was not a sound, but an absence of one. The bell that was meant to summon the enslaved to the fields did not ring. It was a silence so profound, so alien to the rigid clockwork of the plantation, that it was in itself a clang of alarm. A young boy, sent from the great house to find out why the morning routine had stalled, was the first to see it. He ran back not with a report, but with a face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. His terror was a contagion, spreading through the cluster of overseers' assistants and house servants who gathered on the veranda, their morning tasks forgotten. Curiosity, stronger than fear, sent two of the junior men towards the fields, their steps hesitant. They saw it from a distance, a strange, still shape against the rising sun, and at first, it did not register. It looked like a marker, or perhaps some bizarre scarecrow left by a drunken prankster. But as they drew closer, the familiar colors of the overseer's coat resolved themselves. The impossible posture of the limbs became clear, and the full, stomach-turning horror of the scene crashed down upon them. They stopped dead in their tracks, their breaths catching in their throats. The image was so grotesque, so outside the realm of their experience, that their minds struggled to accept it. It was a tableau of ultimate desecration. The body, arms outstretched and lashed to the crossbeam, swayed gently, its shadow a long, dark stain upon the green shoots of the new cotton. The news did not spread through words, but through a ripple of stillness, as the enslaved were finally roused from their cabins, not by a bell but by the frantic shouted commands of the terrified junior overseers. They saw the gathering of white men near the great fence post. They were herded forward, their initial sleepy confusion giving way to a dawning sense of dread. And then they saw it. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the very air from the fields. No one spoke. No one cried out. They simply stopped, a silent, dark mass of humanity, and stared. The figure hanging from the post was both familiar and utterly alien. It was the man they had feared, the source of their daily torment, now reduced to a piece of meat on display. The sight was a complex and terrifying poison. There was fear, of course, a deep and primal fear of the retribution that was sure to follow. An act of this magnitude would not go unanswered. The collective punishment would be swift and terrible. Every person in that silent crowd knew that their lives had just become infinitely more precarious. But beneath the fear, other, more complicated emotions stirred. There was a terrifying, secret awe. The sheer audacity of the act was breathtaking. To not only kill the overseer, but to make a monument of his corpse was an act of rebellion so total, so absolute, that it bordered on the divine or the demonic. It was a gesture that spoke a language they all understood, a brutal poetry of vengeance that resonated in the deepest, most hidden parts of their souls. They looked at the figure, at the rope, at the way the head was canted at a broken angle, and they saw not just the death of a man, but the death of an idea. The idea of the overseer's invincibility, of his untouchable power, had been literally strung up for all to see. The Scarecrow was a message, and it was for them as much as it was for their masters. It was a warning of the consequences of rebellion, but it was also a stunning, undeniable testament to its possibility. In the great house, the plantation's carefully constructed illusion of Gentile order shattered. Mr. Braxton, a man whose life was a study in willful ignorance of the brutality that funded his comfort, was forced to confront the raw, violent reality of his world. He stood at his bedroom window, a silver cup of morning coffee trembling in his hand, and stared through a spyglass at the distant, obscene figure. He could not make sense of it. The act was so far beyond his comprehension, so fundamentally disruptive to his understanding of the master-slave dynamic, that it felt like an assault on the laws of nature itself. His wife had taken to her bed, her calls for smelling salts echoing down the hallway. The house servants moved with a fearful, ghost-like quiet, their eyes wide, their faces unreadable masks. The chaos that had erupted was one of profound, internal collapse. The authority of the plantation had been not just challenged, but mocked. The overseer was the enforcer, the physical manifestation of the master's will. To see him displayed in such a contemptuous manner was to see the master himself desecrated. A cold, unfamiliar fear began to creep into Mr. Braxton's heart. He had always seen his slaves as tools, as livestock, as something less than human. He had never considered that they might possess the capacity for such a cold, calculated, and symbolic act of hatred. He looked out at the silent, watching crowd in the fields, and for the first time, he did not see a docile workforce. He saw 100 potential assassins, 100 silent judges. The plantation, which had always felt like his kingdom, now felt like a prison, and he was trapped inside with his jailers. The practical matter of dealing with the body became its own separate horror. No one wanted to touch it. The junior overseers, white men who had yesterday followed Theron's every command, were now terrified of his corpse. The image of him hanging there had imbued him with a kind of dreadful, otherworldly power. Getting him down was a task fraught with a superstitious terror. Finally, under the furious, Bellowing commands of Mr. Braxton, a small group of men approached the post. The enslaved were forced to watch, a silent, unmoving audience. The act of cutting the body down was clumsy and gruesome. The ropes on the wrists were severed, and the arms fell with a sickening, heavy slap against the body's sides. When the main rope was cut, the corpse dropped to the ground, not like a man, but like a sack of meal, landing with a soft, final thud. The spell was broken, but the image remained, burned into the retinas of everyone who had witnessed it. The aftermath was a reign of blind, unfocused terror. Patrols were sent out, not to find a specific person, but to hunt for a ghost. Every cabin was ransacked, every man and woman questioned. The interrogations were brutal, a desperate attempt to reassert control through violence. But they were met with a new and unnerving defense, a profound and universal silence. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Phineas had simply vanished. His cabin was empty, the space beneath the floorboards barren. He had walked into the woods and been consumed by them. His name was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air, a silent, terrifying testament to the fact that one of them had broken the unwritten rules and had not been caught. The plantation was poisoned with paranoia. The white men watched the enslaved with a new, fearful suspicion. The enslaved watched each other, unsure who might break under the pressure, who might trade a name for a moment's relief from pain. The silence that Theron had worked so hard to enforce had now been turned against his masters, a wall of unknowing that they could not breach. The act was never solved. Phineas was never found. He became a story, a whisper that moved through the slave quarters of Tennessee and beyond. The story of the slave who had not just killed his overseer, but had made him a scarecrow, became a powerful piece of folklore. Among the enslaved, it was a tale of righteous vengeance, of a man pushed so far that he became an avenging spirit. He was a symbol of the ultimate resistance, a figure who had met inhumanity with a terrifying symbolic act of his own. The story was told in hushed tones, a secret and empowering myth that reminded them that the human spirit, even in chains, could never be fully extinguished. Among the white communities, the story also took root, but as a different kind of tale. It became a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the inherent savagery that they believed lurked just beneath the surface of their docile workforce. The hanging overseer became a local specter, a restless spirit said to haunt the old Braxton fields, a warning to other masters to maintain a firm hand. The single brutal act of one man was thus absorbed into the history of the place, becoming a dark and enduring legend. It was a rebellion of one, a spark that did not ignite a fire, but instead created a permanent and haunting shadow. The empty fields at dawn, long after the Braxton plantation had crumbled to dust and memory, would for generations be considered a place of profound unease. The story of what had happened there served as a chilling reminder that the quietest surfaces can conceal the most violent depths, and that cruelty, when pushed to its absolute limit, will inevitably find its own terrible and unforgettable answer. The case file on the Tennessee Scarecrow is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.